Good afternoon, dear learner. So I again welcome you back in this teleconferencing session, and the topic for discussion is basic concepts in auditing. So dear learner, you might be knowing that when we talk about auditing, in fact, when we prepare the final accounts, in order to communicate the result of the business operation to the management, to the shareholders, to the government, and to the other various interested parties, we have to get the accounts audited so that the activities which have taken place during particular financial year can communicate the result in the same sense in which the various interested party needs. Though I'll discuss it later on, where the auditing of the account is compulsory or where the audit of account is not compulsory or it is optional. So before moving ahead, I would like to let you know about the basic concept of auditing. So as the learner, you might be knowing that basically the practice of auditing the accounts of public institution existed as early as in the ancient Egyptian, the Greeks and Roman. This concept is very old concept in fact, and from where this concept has taken place, in fact, when we talk about the origin of the auditing, basically it is the 18th century. It was the result of industrial revolution, which resulted in the increase of trading and the business operation of the industrial undertaking, which require huge amount of capital. So it was quite impossible for the small entrepreneur to meet out the requirement of huge amount of capital due to their limited resources. In fact, when they were not in a position to meet out the requirement of huge amount of capital, the joint stock companies came into existence. So when the joint stock company came into existence, where it is the shareholders who contribute the capital, and it is really very difficult for shareholder to look after the day-to-day activity, the routine operation, in fact the business concern. So the persons who have vested their interest, the persons who have invested their funds, a particular form of organization, maybe in the form of joint stock companies. So definitely the persons who have vested their funds, who are known as shareholders, would be interested to know the accurate position of that particular business concern, and they also need the safety of their investments. So then it is very much clear that the shareholders who don't have the ample time to intervene in the routine operation of the business organization, and they also need the safety of their investment, the need was felt that there must be an independent person who would check the authenticity of the books of the accounts which have been maintained by the business organization. And definitely that independent person, what we call is auditor, will also report about the authenticity, about the accuracy, and about the true and fair picture of the financial position of that particular concern to the shareholders, so that the shareholders can come to know about the true and fair view of the organization, and they can take the decision accordingly. Here, as I have already discussed, that the shareholders are large in numbers, because, dear learners, in the form of joint stock companies, when the shareholders are large in number, so really for them it becomes almost next to impossible that they come and check the status of the books of the accounts, whether their funds have been properly utilized or not, whether the organization is earning a good amount of return on their investments. So when they feel that their fund is not properly exploited, in that case they can take the decision accordingly, and the need of getting the accounts audited arises, because there are various ways where the things can be manipulated, or the window dressing in the preparation of the final accounts take place. So when the window dressing takes place, when the things are manipulated in one or another way, one cannot have the exact or true and fair view of the books of the accounts maintained by the organization for a particular accounting period. So that is why the concept of auditing has got more and more importance these days, because once we get the accounts audited and where our interest is invested to the organization, we can easily come to know about so many things about that particular organization only by going through the report of the auditor, which has to be provided to the shareholders. So just by going through the report given by the auditors, they can have a fair idea about the financial or the profitability position of that particular organization. Sometimes when the accounts are being audited by the auditor, and when the auditor feels that there is some sort of discrepancy, or the accounting concepts and conventions have not been properly followed while maintaining the books of the accounts, or while preparing the financial statements, that is what we call income statements and balance sheet. So when these things are unable to provide a fair view about the business operation of the particular organization, then really the decision taken by the person concerned may or may not be accurate. That is why this concept of auditing is getting more and more importance these days. So, dear learners, as you see these slides, that as per the Companies Act 1956, the audit of the joint stock company has been made compulsory, and a person shall not be appointed as auditor of a joint stock companies until or unless he possesses the qualification of chartered accountant as per the meaning of Chartered Accountants Act 1949. So a person who is a chartered accountant is act as auditor for the joint stock company. But here, if we want to appoint sometime the internal auditor, because sometimes what happens, when the number of transactions are very large in number, we need to appoint internal auditor so that the person appointed for this purpose can keep a vigilance on the books of the accounts during the financial year. So as the accounts progress, the auditing also get progressed. So by doing so, the moment the final accounts are prepared or when the accounting period is over, shareholders who are very much interested in knowing the financial status of that particular concern so far as the state of affairs are concerned, they can easily and quickly come to know about the state of affairs of the organization. So when we talk in terms of internal auditor, so the internal auditor is appointed by the top management of that organization, and so far as the qualifications of internal auditor is concerned, it is not always mandatory that he should be a chartered accountant. The qualification of chartered accountant is must only for the external auditor, only for the independent auditor. So when the top management has asked somebody to look into the matters, to look into the books of the accounts during the whole financial year, we call that person as internal auditor. So the internal auditor is basically appointed only in those organizations which are very big in size, where number of transactions are very large in number, so that he can take each and every transaction and can report of the state of affairs of that particular organization accurately. So the main disadvantage of the internal audit is that since a person or a team of more than one person is engaged in the routine checking, in the routine activities of the business for the auditing purpose, it is extravagant. It involves comparatively more cost. So this internal audit is meant only for those organizations where the owners are large number, that is what we call shareholders in case of public sector undertakings. So when they need quick results, they always approach the top management to appoint the internal auditor, where the possibilities of detecting the errors and the fraud may easily be traced out. So that is why this concept of internal auditing came into existence. So, as dear learners, I have explained you that auditing is nothing but it is a systematic and scientific examination of the books of the account with a view to determine the accuracy, with a view to determine the true and fair position of that particular concern so far as the state of affairs of that particular organizations are concerned. So, the definition of auditing has been given by many stalwarts in their own ways. So if we see the definition of the auditing according to the R.K. Moss, a very renowned person in the field of auditing, so he has defined the auditing that it is in fact concerned with the verification of accounts, accounting data, with determining the accuracy and reliability of accounting statements, accounting reports. So here the thing which is very important is that sometimes when we talk about accountancy and auditing simultaneously, the thing should be very clear in the mind of the person. In fact, what is the basic difference between these two important terms, accountancy and auditing? So here, you know, accountancy is concerned with the checking of the transactions recorded in the books of the accounts, extraction of trial balance and preparation of final accounts. So dear learners, when we talk about accountancy, that basically in accountancy what we do is that we prepare the final accounts, we maintain the books of the accounts, we record each and every transaction in the concerned book, we post them to ledger, then we extract the trial balance, and finally the final accounts, where we generally prepare the two income statement, that is profit and loss and balance sheet. Whereas when we talk in terms of auditing, so it is a systematic and scientific examination of the books of accounts with a view to determine the accuracy and reliability of accounting statement and reports. So here it is very much clear the difference between accountancy and auditing. So once the accounting work is over, once the job of accountant is over, where each and every transaction is recorded in the primary books of the account, then it is posted to ledger, and then with the help of these ledgers we extract the trial balance and then finally the final accounts, where we prepare income statements, that is profit and loss and balance sheet. Once the job of accountant is over, the job of auditor starts. So once the accounts are prepared, then the auditor start his function, that whether the final accounts which are prepared for a particular period exhibit a true and fair position of the organization or not. So for that very purpose, the auditor is appointed who go through each and every transaction as per his convenience and as per the availability of the time, with a view to find out the errors or to detect the errors and the fraud if taken place during the preparation of the final accounts. That is what we call auditing. So I think, dear learners, the difference between these two important terms might have been clear, that once the job of accountant is over, preparing the final accounts and all that, then the job of auditor starts, and the auditor generally starts his work with a view to find out the error and the frauds taken place while preparing the final accounts, while maintaining the books of the account. So this is the basic difference between accountancy and auditing. So here again, very important thing, the difference between auditing and investigation. So if we see it minutely, very literally in fact, both the term seems to be the same. But sometimes when we talk about investigation, investigation is also done with a view to determine the financial position of the state of affair of that particular concern, and same is in the case of auditing. But here students must be very clear about these two terms, auditing and auditing and investigation. So in fact, investigation is a broader term. Investigation of a particular organization is done for a specific purpose, whereas the auditing of the books of the accounts is routine in nature. Periodically, or when the accounting year, financial year comes to an end, where the auditing is mandatory, the audit of accounts is done. But in case of investigation, investigation has never been mandatory. Say for example, if I, being an entrepreneur, want to give the funds to some other organization, then definitely before extending this percentage or before giving this amount to the other organization, I would like to know the financial status of that particular organization. So I can go for the investigation of that particular organization, that say for example for the last 5 years or for the last 10 years, what in fact this organization has achieved and what has been the credibility of this organization during the last 5 years or 10 years. So when a very minute exercise is done regarding the books of the accounts, regarding the preparation of the final accounts of that particular organization, with the view to extending the facilities to that organization. That is what we call investigation. So that means that auditing is done every year, where it is mandatory at the end of the financial year, whereas investigation is not mandatory at all, and investigation may be done for a particular organization for more than 1 year, and it is always done for a specific purpose. If you want to collaborate with some other organization, so before having a collaboration with that organization, definitely you would like to know the exact position of that particular organization, that whatever those people are stating, whether that is according to their statement or not. So for that purpose, if some sort of exercise is formed, that is what we call investigation. So one more important thing is that audit is performed on the behalf of owner of the organization, whereas investigation may be carried out on the behalf of the outsider. So as I have already explained, that auditing is always carried out by the auditor on the behalf of the owner of that organization, that the owner wants to know about the exact position of all the state of affairs have taken place during a particular financial year. Sometimes the employees of that particular organization, they may indulge in the small practices, they can manipulate, they can have window dressing while preparing the final accounts. So in order to detect the errors and frauds, the audit work is carried out by the auditor qualified for that purpose, whereas the investigation is done always by the outside person. And I have already given a very good example, that if two organizations are going to collaborate, or if one organization is going to give the funds to the another organization, then definitely they would like to know the exact status of that organization for the last 6 years, 10 years, as per their requirement or as per their objectives. So this is also the basic difference between the investigation and auditing. As I already explained, auditing is generally carried out after 6 months or 1 year, whereas investigation is carried out for more years. And this I have also explained, that audit is compulsory in case of joint stock companies, whereas investigation is not compulsory. It is only for a specific purpose. So here the objectives of the auditing, we may have a primary objective and we may have the secondary objective. So as per the Companies Act 1956, the main objective, the prime objective of the auditing, that I have already explained, that it is basically carried out just to know the exact, true and fair picture of the financial status of a business concern. So the Companies Act 1956 provide the auditing compulsory for the joint stock organization where there are more than one owner, or it is only the shareholders who are the real owner in case of joint stock companies, who are living at a very far place, have a very hectic schedule, may or may not be in a position to intervene in the routine activities of the business organization. So for that very purpose, in order to ensure them that what whatever the transactions have taken place during a particular year, or whatever activities have been performed during a particular financial year, exhibit a true and fair position of that particular organization. So, the secondary objective of auditing is to examine the books of accounts. So, when the auditor examines the books of the accounts, in such a process, certain errors and frauds are also detected. I may give you a few examples so far as the errors are concerned, the frauds are concerned. So these errors are errors of commission. So when the transaction has taken place, and at the initial stage when that transaction is to be recorded in the books of the account, transaction has been recorded with the wrong amount. Say for example, if I have purchased furniture worth rupees 2 lakh, but unfortunately I record this transaction at the initial stage against rupees 20,000. So these are the errors which cannot be detected by trial balance. Though when we prepare the trial balance, the kind of errors, the arithmetical errors can easily be detected once the trial balance is prepared. So, when at the initial stage when the transaction has been recorded against the wrong amount, that kind of error cannot be detected by the trial balance. But when we have a voucher, when we have evidence and proof, and when the auditor is going to look into the matters very minutely, then definitely he can easily find out this error, that the furniture was purchased against rupees 2 lakh, whereas it is recorded in the books of the account against 20,000 only. Then errors of omission. So sometimes when we are entered into the transactions, but sometimes when we forget to record a transaction in the books of the account, that kind of error could not be detected by operation of trial balance. But it is only the audit work where if the things are carried out in a systematic and scientific manner, then definitely we can find out that kinds of error. Compensating error, that say for example, if I have to debit the account of Mr. Ram by rupees 200, but instead of rupees 200 I debited him only by rupees 20, and while debiting the account of Mr. Sham, I had to debit him rupees 20, but instead of 20 I debited him by rupees 200. So this is kind of compensating errors which cannot be detected by the trial balance. So here the importance of audit work come into existence, that when the audit work is carried out, when each and every transaction is gone through very minutely, then it is the auditor who can detect this kind of errors. So dear learners, the basic concepts as I have explained in auditing, that you must be very much careful, you must be very much particular while getting the account audited of a particular business. You must first of all see the nature of the transaction you are auditing the work. So therefore, in toto, I can say that audit work is done with a view to determine the accuracy of the financial status of the organization as a whole, so as to provide the accurate status to the management or to the parties who have vested their interest in that particular organization. So thank you, learners. I do hope that you might have got these few basic concepts which I have discussed in a right spirit, and we will meet in future whenever we will have a session on auditing. Thank you very much.
Welcome to the session on nutrition education, concept and practice. Now, in your course materials, you have seen a lot of material related to nutrition education. So, in this program, what we are going to do is to focus on basically what it is and how can it be planned and implemented. As you can understand, these are very crucial features when we talk about nutrition education. It's a question of reaching out to a particular target group and communicating the messages that we have in mind, nutrition related, and in the case of your other course materials, health related as well. And the idea is to bring about change in the target group's attitudes and practices. So let us now first look at what is nutrition education. If you look at the slide that we have for you, what we are saying is that nutrition education is concerned primarily with the creation and establishment of habits pertaining to all types of food practices, but especially those associated with improvement in individual patterns of food consumption. Now, when you look at this whole idea of patterns of food consumption, we all know that, for example, when we look at ourselves, we also have a certain individual pattern of food consumption. This is different from a family pattern of consumption, it's different from looking at it at a community level. So when we talk about ourselves or our individual patterns of consumption, we are looking at what kind of foods we eat, what is the frequency with which we eat them, is there any variation from day to day, from week to week, from month to month, and from year to year in some cases. So what happens is that we are looking at our own food practices, the food practices of the individual members. So that's why the slide talks about individual patterns of food consumption. It is not just a process of transferring facts or information about the nutritive value of foods, the role of food in preventing nutritional deficiency diseases, or methods of food production, marketing, distribution, and preparation. So what is the key point that we are getting out of this particular visual? What we are looking at is that it is a process. We have said that it is a process where we are communicating messages from the person who is conveying a message to the target group. So it's basically a process of communication. Beyond that process, we are trying to go something more than that particular process. It's not just that process. So we're trying to actually end up with a change. That means it's not just the act or the process of transferring information or transferring a message. It is the process of following it up so that we know that the population or individual members in the population, they are undergoing some change in their attitudes or practices. Of course, we are always talking in a desirable direction. In the case of this, we can only consider it a valid outcome of a nutrition education program if we are getting a positive type of a change in the individual and the community patterns of consumption. What is the fundamental objective of nutrition education? We all know that we can look at it in different ways, but this is a nice organized way to look at the objectives of nutrition education. Helping individuals establish food habits and practices to meet nutritional needs of the body. This is basically talking about nutritional needs of the body. Now, as you can understand, this is a very, very crucial factor that we are talking about, because the basic aim of eating the food is to eat it in such proportions and combinations that we can meet the nutritional needs of the body. The second part that we are looking at is establishing food habits and practices adapted to the cultural pattern and food resources of the area in which we live or the target group lives. So what do we mean by this? This is another very interesting aspect. As you can see, it's not just enough if we have communication skills. We need to understand the setting in which the target group is operating. What is their social economic background? What is their culture? How are they relating to their food choices? Which foods do they avoid? Which do they select? Of course, these aspects we will be discussing again as we go along. But you can see that it is not just enough to convey certain food messages related to foods and nutrition, but it is to make sure that those messages are adapted to the cultural pattern and the food resources of the area. Now, it's all very well. We can say we want to have this practice, but the fact is that food available, is the food that we are promoting, is available in that particular region. There's no point giving message if those food resources are not available in the area. Or is it too expensive? Are those foods too expensive for that particular target group? Or is it a food that they consider of very low status? Or is there a taboo on that food? There are so many myths and misconceptions regarding food basically, and you all know that according to our religion, according to our social background, according to our culture, there are some foods that are considered very good foods or high status foods. There are other foods which are considered of low status or low prestige. So we tend to omit some types of foods and include other types of foods. So when we say food resources which are available, we are basically talking not just in terms of whether they are physically available in that area, they are available in the market, they are available in the fields or as a result of agricultural processes, but we're also talking about whether we are permitting those foods for that particular target group or that society's permitted consumption of that particular food item in that particular culture. So now we go to the next aspect, which is why should nutrition programs be planned? We all know, we talk about planning, we talk about implementation, we talk about so many different aspects. But we also must know the reason for this. Why should nutrition education programs be planned? Very carefully, if we go through it, we see that the reason for planning is that we're trying to motivate people to adopt intelligent daily food consumption practices, consistent with health, but within the limit of available food and economic resources. So we are basically motivating people. And what are we motivating them to do? We are basically trying to make them adopt intelligent daily food consumption practices. We understand intelligent, but we have to also emphasize that they should be consistent with health. We may make certain food choices, but over time research has shown that certain types of food consumption patterns are associated with the risk of disease. For example, if we are consuming too little of certain nutrients, we are very likely to get nutritional deficiency disorders. On the other hand, we may have certain nutrients, for example, rather foods or items like fats, like carbohydrates. If we put them too much in our diet or consume too much of them, what will happen is that again we get certain types of chronic degenerative diseases. We all know these are associated with diseases like diabetes, like heart disease. So these are some of the diseases that are coming up. And very interesting, what we find is, unlike what was thought earlier, people used to say that India is a relatively developing country and therefore have less of prevalence of these type of diseases. But we are seeing a huge change now in urban populations, even rich rural populations, with the decrease in obesity, with the decrease in the tendency to just indulge in sedentary activities. What is happening is that the exercise levels are going down and the food consumption of fats and carbohydrate-rich foods, that is going up in the population. So we are finding a very paradoxical situation where undernutrition is also at fairly high levels. At the same time, overnutrition is also at fairly high levels. So this is also giving you an insight that this process is so broad. We have to talk about so many different types of target groups in the population. We are talking not just about the poor, but also about the rich. Almost every strata of the population requires sustained nutrition education in order to make those intelligent food choices which would be consistent with their health. And of course, as we were talking earlier, we are also considering the limits of the available resources of the food that are available to them within their economic resources. So now let us go on to the next visual, which is telling us more about the planning process. We know that planning is very essential. We have just looked at what are the reasons why we plan this kind of process. So this visual is telling you about the two key elements in planning. The first one is establishing specific but realistic objectives. Specific but realistic objectives. The second one is setting attainable targets when plans are being made to educate people about nutrition. So we have two aspects here. One is related to objectives, the other is related to targets. Now let me just give you a little more details about these 2 points. Now when we are talking about specific objectives, now it's very easy to start a program without actually laying down these kind of objectives. What are the objectives that we are going to achieve by doing this particular nutrition education program? It's a very simplistic way to just go into a community, go with our own assumptions about what they have as their problems, what are they facing, what are the challenges there in terms of their nutritional status, and to go ahead and communicate a message. That is not enough. We have to actually set down very clear, specific objectives about what we intend nutrition education program to do. And we will further, in our further discussion, we will talk about how these objectives are laid or what are the aspects that we need to consider while going through the entire process. And the second part that we were talking about is attainable targets. It is very well to say that I am planning a 2-day nutrition education program, and this program is going to result in a change in the practices of people. This is actually a very, very wrong thing to do, because nutrition education is a process that needs to be gradual, it needs to be sustained. The same inputs will need to be repeated again and again to the particular target group. Why? Because we have a certain level of attitude, certain resistance in populations. Some populations may be more willing to change, other populations may be less willing to change. So we have to actually study that particular target group in great detail. It is very, very simplistic to just go to, say, a village or a urban slum and start a nutrition education program and expect to do wonders in 2 or 3 days. It just doesn't happen that way. So when we are talking about targets, we have to look at very reasonable, very attainable targets. It's okay if those targets look to be less ambitious. That's all right. They would still be attainable. And in this context, what I would be emphasizing on is really the duration of the program and the types of inputs that we are providing in the program. Because if it is a sustained program, you can expect no change in the population. If it's just a 1 or 2 or a week-long program, what you would basically achieve is a level of awareness in the population. You cannot expect to work wonders, as I was mentioning earlier. So now let us come to the next aspect, which is a look at the characteristics of the target groups that we should keep in mind. As I was mentioning, we have been talking about objectives of particular programs, setting particular specific objectives. Now how do we go about doing that? Let us look at the visual, which is telling us basically what are the types of questions that we should be asking. You will of course realize that during the presentation what have been going on, that we have tried to put for you some of the key questions and then trying to answer some of those questions or giving you the key aspects that you keep in mind. Now this is a slide where we are asking a question, but the answer is also in the form of the types of questions that you would need to ask yourself when you are planning or setting out specific objectives. So what is the extent of the target group's knowledge about food and nutrition? How much does the target group know about the particular aspect on which you are organizing a nutrition education program? How much do they know about, say, vitamin A deficiency? Do they know how it affects the eyes? And so on. So each of these nutrients or nutritional deficiency disorders, or about any topic, whether it's food preservation or food conservation or food combinations, any of these particular aspects, we need to analyze or look at what is the extent of the target group's knowledge about food and nutrition. Now, what special ideas do they have about foods? Now, here also it's a very critical area, because every individual, every community has certain specific ways in which they look about one or the other food item, which they have available to them. So, this is another important question that we need to ask. Are there any common food practices? Now, if you are talking a meal pattern, for example, and what is consumed in each meal, say breakfast, lunch, dinner, as examples, what is happening is that each community individual has a certain set of food practices which are commonly adopted. So this is another area that we need to look at in great detail when we are looking at the characteristics of target groups. Now another point is which foods are readily available to that target group. Again, this is a characteristic of both the target group and the environment of the target group. That is the particular community or the region or the particular state to which those particular groups belong. Because what happens is that you will find a lot of variation in the types of crops which are grown. And not only the crops that are grown, as I was mentioning earlier, it's not just a question of having those crops available, they are being produced in that region, they are available in the markets of that region. That is not enough. The idea is also available in terms of food which are socially approved, foods which are considered appropriate for consumption in that particular region. For example, you may be having millets growing in a particular region, but the people may not be willing to consume it, particularly in, say, urban areas, and the rich in the urban areas may not like to consume millets. Now, another interesting trend is coming up, which I have been noticing in various parts of the country, and that is that people are actually putting together combinations of cereals, pulses, nuts and oil seeds as a kind of health mix. So all you do is you reconstitute that with water or milk, and then you consume these kind of foods. So these are actually natural foods which are ground, and they are including a combination of several types of foods. Now what is happening is that over time we have had dietary recommendations which are linked to recommending foods that are combinations or adopting varieties of foods in the diet. So this is something that is very interesting and which is picking up recently about how to consume varieties of foods. For example, such mixes may include millets also. They may include cereals which are rather uncommonly consumed in that region. But this is again giving the opportunity to the population to adopt a new kind of a combination or a food. And of course, whether it is available to that population depends on whether the population is actually having access to that product, of course, and whether the population is willing to consume that product. So you may have products coming into the market, how much they sell and how much people adopt that particular food is a very important criterion. Now let us move on to another aspect related to this, and that is in the whole nutrition education process, what are the kind of key points that we remember? What are the very, very crucial aspects? You can say this is the core of the area. We've talked about the concepts. When we practice nutrition education, what are some of the important things that we need to keep in mind? So if we look at the visual, what we are basically saying is that no educational program in nutrition should be carried out in isolation. The second point is that educational programs should be coordinated with other activities. For example, health, agriculture, childcare. Now, what are we understanding by it? It is a rather statement that you may not have seen very often. And when we say that new programs or new educational programs should not be considered in isolation. Earlier, we have had programs where there is a combination of nutrition education with nutrition supplementation. I'm sure you are aware of what nutrition supplementation is. That is when we add to the diets of populations extra foods or extra nutrients which will improve the quality of their diets, which will prevent nutritional deficiencies. So what is happening is that our programs usually incorporate nutrition education not itself. It is combined with certain other inputs. You can combine nutrition education with various types of sectors, as we have been mentioning, like for example agriculture or health. So what happens is that along with all the services that are being provided, we are also adding nutrition education as a component or as an input. So viewing it in isolation is not a very useful process. The reason is that unless the target group is motivated to join a particular program as a beneficiary or even as a change agent, you are not going to get a properly receptive audience for nutrition education in most cases. So giving this in combination makes it that much more effective from the point of view of communicating certain messages. And of course, now if we look at two other aspects before we discuss it a little further, some specialized programs may be directed towards individuals. such as mothers of infants. This is also, we are very familiar with this particular aspect, that there are specialized programs for specific individuals, such as mothers, such as fathers, such as other people in the community who may be decision makers. So we have specialized programs which are individual based. We also have specialized education in nutrition required for those individuals who suffer from chronic or degenerative diseases. This is again something that we have been looking at earlier in this program. We looked at the need for, say, urban groups, the rich in the urban groups, the rich in the rural areas who need more specialized education. And another trend which is coming up is that there is so much of junk food that is available, which is accorded a certain prestige value, but which may be actually making populations very fat. This is something that is seen in America in larger numbers, where you actually find that the poorer people are more obese than the people who are rich. This is something that you would not normally expect. In our country, usually the trend is that according to the income group, usually you don't find obesity or high incidence of obesity in low income groups. You find it more in the high income groups. But again, these patterns are changing. If foods which are rich in energy and fat, they tend to become cheaper and they become more available to audiences, and they start consuming more of such foods, the same trend will become evident in India as well. So we have a lot of influences on us, on our children, on through different media. So what is happening is that you are being shaped, your attitudes are being influenced and shaped by all these different types of influences. So this is becoming a very problematic area. For example, we have young children now who watch TV, who watch advertisements. They find a lot of advertisements for junk foods, and they are encouraged to consume foods. That makes them a prestige food for the small child. The small child pesters the parents to buy the food, and at the end of it you have a situation really where the child is motivated to consume that food. And the end result very often is that the child may go into some kind of nutritional disorder. And it's very, very strange, but true, that now you're having even children with heart disease, with hypertension, that is high blood pressure. We could not even imagine such a scenario some time ago. But we are seeing these trends increasingly coming into the population. And so we have to be very, very careful at targeting our messages at even small children, not just their parents. So again, we are talking about very large numbers of people to be educated, large types or variations in types of messages that we have to convey to these populations. Now let us come to the next aspect. Now here it is talking about what is the scope of nutrition education programs. In other words, what are the kinds of themes that we may be addressing when we are conducting nutrition education programs. One is we will be talking about increase in the quantity and quality of foods. Quantity may seem to you a little innocuous kind of a word. What is happening in this case is in certain types of target groups. For example, pregnant women, we have to tell the woman that she has to increase the quantity of food that she consumes. What she was having earlier is not enough. She needs to increase the amount of energy and protein that she includes in her diet, and therefore we are having a situation like this where we need to increase the quantity of foods. Quality, of course, we can understand that we are trying to improve the representation of various types of nutrients in the correct proportions, in the correct amounts in the foods. The second point is ways of improving the nutritive value of the diet. Very important. This is a very practical suggestion. We keep talking about the nutritive value of diet, but we have also to tell the population how do we actually improve the nutritive value of the diet. Give them practical suggestions. The third point that we must talk about is selecting the best diet possible from the food available. Selecting the best diet possible. There are various types of diets which may be possible from the foods that are available, but actually we have to see what are the food combinations that would be best suited to the requirements of that particular individual and to the environment of that individual. And of course, very common type of messages that we may be conveying are related to the storage, preparation and conservation of foods. These are all the different types of themes of nutrition education programs, and we have tried to give you just 4 types of examples. There may be other types of statements or various types of messages that we may be wanting to convey to that particular target group. So this is just like an example, set of examples that you can consider about what would be the scope of nutrition education programs. Now let us come to another interesting aspect, that is what we touched on earlier about changing diets. What are the main considerations that we look at when we are trying to make people change their diets? Let us first look at the visual and then we will discuss it a little more. Two concepts really, traditionalism and resistance to change. We know that groups are very much bound by their traditions. They tend to become resistant to change because they cling to their traditions. There are always people in the community who would discourage change because they have a particular set of attitudes and practices which they believe in, which they believe are beneficial for them, and therefore it's very difficult to bring about change in diets. So let us look at these 2 points now. The primary objective of the educator is not just to change the diet, but to improve them to the extent possible. Not just to change the diet, but to improve the diet to the extent possible. And the second one is the characteristics and experience of the target group determine whether and how fast they will change their attitude and practices. This is also an interesting consideration. It's not necessary that every time we try to communicate messages, the target group will change. So that is why we are using the word whether. Determine whether and how fast they will change their attitudes and practices. So let us discuss this aspect a little bit more, and what are the kind of process models that we can adopt when we are trying to bring about change. Now change obviously means we are changing from one situation to another. So whenever we look at one particular target group, we need to understand what are the beliefs that are prevalent in the community, what are the beliefs that that particular individual subscribes to. Nutrition beliefs, health beliefs, what are the set of beliefs, what are the set of attitudes, what are the set of values that that individual has. What are we beginning with, followed up with the nutrition education process, and what are we going to end up with. So we have certain inputs and outputs in this process, just like with other processes. So what we need to do is find out what is the existing state of the nutrition knowledge of that particular community or that particular individual. And what happens to this knowledge when we submit that individual to nutrition education process. If we use rather technical language now, we need to conduct pre-tests and post-tests. What does it mean? As the terms themselves indicate to you, when we talk about pre, we are talking about before the nutrition education program starts. And what is post-test? Conducted after the nutrition education program is finished for the time being. That means suppose we are talking about a 1-week program or a 2-day program, then after the program is over, we conduct a post-test. This gives us an idea of what is the change in that particular group. Have attitudes changed at all? Are we seeing a kind of change at all in that particular period of time? This can be repeated over a longer duration also. For example, a pre-test can be started at the beginning of the program, say in a particular month, and it can be repeated in some form as the post-test about 2 or 3 months later. For example, if you are using a question, you may use the same set of questions after 3 months and find out whether the group has changed or not, any of their attitudes or practices. So this is something also underlying that whole process which we have been talking about is KAP. That is knowledge, attitudes, practices. Easy to remember, KAP. What we are looking at is initially the group is having a certain set of knowledge. When they are going through this nutrition education program, they are getting some knowledge. Is that enough? Is it going to bring about change? No. Change does not come about at the level of gaining knowledge. That knowledge has to get translated into a positive attitude. This is one of the toughest steps. To get a positive attitude from the community, we have to be very, very careful not to confront their traditional beliefs, but to tell them slowly and gradually that these type of changes are going to make you much healthier, are going to improve your nutritional status, are going to help you improve your diets, which say suppose they are a low income group, then you will talk about in the minimum amount of money or resources, how can you improve your diet. So there are various related considerations. And the final part of KAP, which is practice. Once they have a positive attitude towards a practice, then the likelihood of their actually adopting that practice increases. It is of course not guaranteed. I may have a positive attitude, but I may not actually start adopting that practice. So again you have a lag there between attitude and practice. So we've talked about all different aspects: knowledge, attitude and practice. So when we are conducting, say, a pre-test or a post-test, we may be analyzing same knowledge. That is the first step. If we want to find out whether they have actually gained awareness of the type of concepts and the type of principles and the type of suggestions of food choices that you are recommending, then that should show up in that post-test. After the program is completed, we should be able to say what are the types of changes that have come about in their knowledge base. Similarly with attitudes and practices, of course, we can ask them, that is an indirect way of doing it, that whether they have adopted that practice or not. At the same time, we can also observe whether there is a widespread change in the community or not. And we must remember that this is by no means an easy process, but at the same time it is by no means an impossible process. We all have seen quite drastic changes in our food consumption patterns. Sometimes just a new product in the market and completely change our types of food patterns. For example, some years back, when we didn't have any convenience foods, there was no difficulty in adopting our traditional diet. What has happened over time is, as we have more and more foods which are readily available